This is Kathy, and I'm going to read Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further, and there was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. "That's the very place to spend the night," quacked Mr. Mallard, and so down they flapped. The next morning they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a big, strange, enormous bird came by, and it was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water. So the Mallards followed them all around the pond, and they got another breakfast, better than the first. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out of the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right here in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies with those horrid things rushing about. We have to look somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and around the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mrs. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks just like the place to hatch ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All of their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman named Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs and keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure that they were all there. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, and then Cack, and then Lack, and Mack, and Knack, and Whack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided that he'd go for a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and how to dive. She taught them how to walk in line and to come when they were called and keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. And when at last she felt perfectly safe and perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you knew it, quick as an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. And Mrs. Mallard led them into the water, and away they swam behind her to the opposite bank. And there they waded ashore, and they waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. "Honk, honk," went the horns on the speeding cars. "Quack," went Mrs. Mallard, and she tumbled back again. "Quack, quack, quack, quack," went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself right in the center of the road, and he raised one hand to stop the traffic, and with the other he beckoned the policemen the way they do for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side of the road and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called headquarters. He called Clancy at headquarters, and he said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." And Clancy said, "A family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookstore and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. One old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the streets said, "Well, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud, she tipped her nose up in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen were holding back all the cars so that Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. Right into the public garden. Inside the gates, they all turned around to say thank you to the policemen, and they all smiled and waved goodbye. And when they reached the pond and swam across to the island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. So the ducklings liked their new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they followed the swan boats and ate peanuts. And when the night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end.